Hey, folks, thanks for checking out Reigniting Liberty. I'm Deneen Borelli, and Dr. Tom Borelli is in the house, bringing you the truth in black and white. Well, folks, all eyes are on China as its citizens have taken to the streets to push back against their communist government's zero COVID lockdown policy imposed upon them. Chinese leader Xi Jinping insists the lockdown will save lives and protect the citizens from the virus. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, we're talking about a virus. It's a virus, and the zero COVID approach, it's not working. It's not reality. And again, it's a virus, and viruses, they mutate. So this thing keeps changing over and over again. And we're also talking about 1.4 billion people, Dr. Tom. So in reality, the lockdowns are having an opposite effect on its citizens of all ages. And this is senseless because a lot of people are dying. Despite the risks, China's authoritarian government is being challenged by its citizens in the streets, Dr. Tom.
Yeah, Deneen, well said. Great way to kick off this episode of Reigniting Liberty. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing what is actually happening in China, why it's happening, and the possible consequences of what's going on in the streets in China. The world, as you mentioned, are witnessing the defiance of the Chinese people against its authoritarian government. There are people in the streets upset of these lockdowns that the people are tired of and the adverse consequences to the people who have suffered under these lockdowns. There's actual video footage from protesters in the streets, and we're able to see firsthand what's going on there. And the Chinese authorities do not like this one bit at all. Let's watch. So to kind of recap, it's been 3 years and the Chinese citizens have been under the hammer of these lockdowns. They want freedom like everybody else does in this world. And now they're taking a very courageous stand for standing up against the brutal communist Chinese government. Anger, desperation, fearlessness by these people, and frustration are fueling a violent backlash of these protesters against the authoritarian communist Chinese government. And these protesters know, they absolutely know they're taking a very big risk for fighting back against the brutality of these lockdowns. But the protesters also know there are more of them than they are of the Chinese military and the police. And they also know if they don't take a stand, things will only get worse. Chinese citizens are suffering the consequences of the lockdowns, which is resulting in deadly outcomes for the people in China. Let's discuss a few of these examples. And these are just plain horrific examples. People are locked inside their homes. Doors are sometimes welded in apartment buildings or wired shut. So there's no way for the people to leave these apartment buildings. They don't have access to food, and some are starving. Moreover, some people are just jumping to their death from these buildings, maybe due to starvation, maybe just to the emotional impact of just being locked in your apartment forever. Yeah. People are unable to receive medicine due to shortages and even medical treatment. There are instances where ambulances are unable to reach sick individuals, and some ambulances don't even make the trip. So these lockdowns are completely horrendous to these people. There are also conflicting stories about a huge fire that happened in an apartment building in a city in China. And it's being reported that the fire engines couldn't get close enough to the apartment building because of barricades and abandoned cars. As a result, around 10 people died in this fire, including a 3-year-old child, and many other injuries as well. Well, considering the harsh consequences over the lockdowns, protesters are emboldened. They are emboldened to come together and fight for freedom.
Yes, indeed. That is what they are doing. And to see the images of the people out in the streets with their phones, people videotaping whatever's going on, and then people are videotaping them, videotaping the situation. A lot of things are being documented. But with this defiance in the streets, Dr. Tom, the police and others in authority are physically clashing with protesters as a result of orders from on high to clamp down. While the controls are being stepped up, and what they're trying to do is prevent new gatherings of protests to take place. So you got the strong arm of the police and others in authority are backed by China's state media. Surprise, surprise, right?
Shocking.
Well, yeah, this is from the Wall Street Journal, Dr. Tom. No Chinese media have mentioned the protests, some of which took place on the campuses of elite universities. Government offices in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities where they occurred haven't responded to repeated requests for comment. And that is at the time of this recording of our discussion, Dr. Tom. And of course, Dr. China's state media backs Xi Jinping. They back him with his zero COVID policies. Shocker. And here's another thing. There are reports that there are these Chinese bots on Twitter. And what they are doing is they're flooding Twitter with sexually explicit images and graphics. They're putting up porn and escort ads when major cities are typed in for a search. They're trying to flood the zone, so to speak, so that people, especially if you're in China and if you do have access to any of this, they can't see the news. They can't see what's going on. So, I mean, this is like a coordinated effort here. It's like one thing after another that's happening. So because of media censorship, the protesters in some way, some form or another, they were able to get some access to social media platforms to post video and other content. And so the protesters also came up with a new tool, Dr. Tom, that I was reading about. It's a new symbol to get their message out. And what they are simply doing is holding up a blank piece of white paper as a form of protest and as a form of pushing back on the censorship that they can't speak out, they can't be vocal. And this is their way of making a statement. And that made the news as well, Dr. Tom. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Over the weekend, amid one of the largest nationwide demonstrations that China has seen in decades, demonstrators used few or no words at all to protest Beijing's strict pandemic policies, which show little sign of ending, even as most of the rest of the world moves on. Across multiple major cities and university campuses, many protesters held up blank pages, causing some online observers to coin it the white paper revolution. A Chinese stationery company issued a denial after rumors spread that it would suspend the sale of such paper. They denied it.
Control, right?
They denied it. Wow, there's a lot going on there, Dr. Tom. But of course, the Chinese authorities, they tried to put an end to the social media access to keep the world from knowing the truth. And it's known that harsh punishment, and this is a no-brainer, people know there's harsh punishment and harassment because of the consequences for those who do speak out and push back against the leader and against the Communist Party. Any criticism whatsoever, they are cracked down on, and they are cracked down on hard. And so you have China, it's a total surveillance state. They have eyes and ears everywhere, and they have the capacity, the capability to identify the protesters. There are millions of surveillance cameras, boots and eyes on the ground, and they are watching and they are taking action. But I got to tell you, for these folks to be out in the streets the way that they are, it's amazing to see.
No, Denise, that's right. And look at the consequences. What choices do they have, right?
Yeah.
If they sit back, they get locked in an apartment and potentially starve to death. That's not good.
Yep.
Or you take to the streets and you rebel, and you could be, as you mentioned, could be clearly identified with these cameras that they have all over the state of China. So it is really, it's a bad choice either way. But these courageous people, they've just had enough and they're willing to take the risk. And the more people that do it, the more people will have courage. And it has, the potential really to spiral into something massive. And that's exactly what the communist Chinese government does not want to see.
Yep.
But in the end, why is this happening? It all has to do with Xi's zero COVID policy. That is the root cause of the problem. The lockdowns over the years have created a huge problem because when they locked down these cities when there was a little flare up, and then they opened it up again. But the bigger problem is that the majority of the 1.4 billion people in China do not have any immunity at all. No immunity at all to the virus, because they were locking down every time it would flare up. And so people weren't exposed. So now you have a massive amount of people who have no immunity. And that itself is a huge risk.
Yeah.
And that's going to happen. It's going to fuel a major outbreak if and when they release from these lockdowns. So she set up this horrible policy that has clearly backfired not only on the people with respect to the horrible consequences of being shut down, locked down, and locked up in your own home, but at the same time, he prevented the spread of the virus, which you cannot stop.
Sure.
And you mentioned that earlier introduction. You cannot stop this virus. You can hide, but as soon as you come out, it's going to come out and infect you. And with a massive number of people in China with no immunity, that has the potential for a massive outbreak of COVID. And the problem for the Chinese government and for the people, they do not have the public health infrastructure, they do not have the hospital beds to take care of potentially millions of people who could be, suffer some of the consequences, the adverse health consequences of COVID. Look, it's just a numbers game, right?
Yeah.
If only 1% of the population gets severely ill, well, 1% times 1.4 billion, that's a lot of people, right?
Yes, it is.
That's simple math, but it's all Xi's problem. It's all his fault because he established the zero COVID policy, which resulted in the lockdowns. Now, another problem they have in China is they did have a vaccine, but it was the Chinese-made vaccine, and it wasn't that effective at all. And they refused to use vaccines from other countries around the world. So that's another reason why they have a low natural immunity. And they also, because of lockdowns, but they also have a low immunity because their vaccines didn't work at all. Even if these restrictions are eased just a little bit, it's going to cause a huge public health challenge in China. Bloomberg Intelligence reports, quote, reopening could see 5.8 million in ICU. Imagine that, 5.8 million in intensive care units. China does not have that infrastructure to take care of that many people. And there's no way an uncontrolled wave of infections can be managed. That's a simple fact. And again,
Sure.
all of this is because of the zero COVID policy that Xi had instituted there in China.
Sure. Well, he is in a corner for sure, Xi Jinping. If he doesn't ease up, Dr. Tom, the Chinese people will likely continue to protest. The government will continue to crack down on them by using the police, by using the military, anything that they can to push back on the protesters. But on the other hand, this could also backfire against the Communist Party. If he eases the lockdown, the virus will spread, as you mentioned, and overwhelm its hospital system. Now, Dr. Tom, you had the opportunity to talk about this recently on Newsmax on Wake Up America weekend. And as I recall, you criticized Xi zero COVID policy. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, Danina, as we're kind of discussing, had the opportunity to explain this on Newsmax, and you mentioned also in the introduction, we're dealing with a virus that is one highly contagious and continually mutates. So it represents a huge public health threat, just the number of infections, and you can't hide from it. That's the bottom line. That's the most important thing. What a lot of people don't realize is one of the reasons we will never get rid of COVID is that it resides in animals. So you can get rid of all the COVID in people, but there's going to be a reservoir in all different types of animals. Then the animals can then reinfect the people. It's not going to go away. So what I suggested, which is far too late now in China, in an ideal world, and trust me, this would be hard to implement, what you want is kind of a controlled burn, where you allow a population to slowly get exposed to the virus so that then you get natural immunity. But most important, as part of that, you protect the elderly who are most vulnerable to the virus. If you set up the system like that, you would have more natural immunity, and you'd be able to protect the elderly population. That's the way it should have been done. But now, as you mentioned, Xi's in nowhere's land. He's actually in a corner. If he loosens up, it's going to rip through the 1.4 billion population there in China and overwhelm this system. If he doesn't remove these restrictions, he's going to continue to have these protests in the streets because of the adverse, severe consequences of the lockdowns themselves. He's in no man's land.
Well, not only that, Dr. Tom, then there's the global economic consequences from the lockdown that is happening. America, the world relies on China for numerous input products for everyday items like chips and computers and cars, appliances, also medicine ingredients for different things like antibiotics. They're made in China. You look around your house, people, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff that is made in China. Now, Dr. Tom, Axios reports, and I quote, a new COVID calamity is hammering China with a surge in infections prompting a return of lockdowns, including in some manufacturing areas that supply the West. So we are going to feel the consequences of this. So keep in mind the holidays are coming. You want to run out and get your favorite gifts for folks you might not be able to. One example is the latest iPhone. I was reading that, Dr. Tom. It will be hard to get because the main plant, Taiwan-owned Foxconn, had violent protests over low pay and the lockdown policies. So, Tom, you talked about a little of this as well over the weekend on Newsmax, and you have one point where you highlighted was the risks that are involved with the globalization, with corporations and inflation and a disrupted supply chain. If you can just talk to us about that.
Well, sure. Not only did I talk about the science aspect, but also got a little bit into the economics.
Because you're so smart.
Yeah, right. So what's going on now is the fact that, as you mentioned, decreased production in China is going to adversely impact some products and impact our supply chain. In fact, disrupt our supply chain. And what does that mean? Well, that means a shortage of supply of products means that there will be higher demand with lower supply, which actually lead to higher inflation. I also made the point that the Federal Reserve can raise interest rates, but if there's a supply chain disruption, higher interest rates have nothing to do with the lack of supply. And when people want it, they will be willing to pay up more for it. So there's the inflation risk. But also, I also mentioned the importance that now global corporations understand that there is a risk, an economic risk to globalization. Because if you rely on making your products in China, like Apple is, and you no longer can get the supply from China, it's going to hurt the bottom line of your company. And now many corporations, these multinational corporations, are understanding that they got a little bit too relaxed and relying way too much on China. And the bottom line here again is, what good can come from relying on an authoritarian government?
Sure.
Hello. I think that a lot of companies learned that too with Russia recently when companies had invested in Russia. And we saw what Putin did when he invaded Ukraine, and many companies had to pull out of there as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge risk, not only to the humans, the human effect with respect to being stuck in a communist country, an authoritarian country in a dictatorship essentially, but there's also an adverse consequence to companies, multinational companies that were not that smart when they put a lot of their eggs in these countries' basket, because now they're being cracked down with lower supply and they don't have products to sell. And it's going to have an impact on the company and also, as I mentioned, an impact on inflation as well. And there's also one other thing we haven't discussed yet, and that is the old President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Remember those two, Deneen?
Oh, that.
Oh, that, right. Well, the New York Post reports, quote, President Biden's family has extensive business relationship with Chinese government-linked companies, and the first son, Hunter Biden, reportedly still owns a 10% stake in a Chinese state-backed private equity firm. So it looks like Hunter Biden is still invested in China.
Compromised much, or
Yeah, exactly. Do you think?
Nothing to see here?
Nothing to see here. Move right along.
Oh boy.
Also from the New York Post, quote, the Biden administration said Monday that Chinese protesters are right to call for an end to the draconian COVID-19 lockdowns, without endorsing a widespread calls for Beijing's authoritarian president Xi Jinping to resign. So they say that people have a right to protest, but they're not going as far as being very critical of the essential dictator there in China, Xi. Right. So I wonder why. As you mentioned, Deneen, compromised much?
Yeah, that's just came into my head. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's why the Republicans, when they take over the House in January, they're going to be doing a big-time investigation on the links of both Bidens, the Biden family, and whether or not they were being compromised by countries like Russia, China, and even Ukraine.
Looking forward to that, Dr. Tom. So what happens now? What happens next? The bottom line is Xi Jinping is boxed in, literally, with wrapping paper and everything. He is painted into a corner. He's not going to admit any wrongdoing with his zero COVID policies. And it's unlikely he will reverse the lockdown because of the risk of overwhelming the country, the public health risks, everything you laid out previously. So the pressure is on the population, and the population will continue to rebel about this communist government. The outcome, very uncertain, Dr. Tom. I mean, who knows, right? You know, will the protests continue, and how will the population respond to harsh treatment from the police, from the military? Will they rebel, forcing more change in leadership? Will a crackdown even work? Will she invade Taiwan? I mean, is anyone thinking about that to distract its population and the world? The grand distraction. We see it all the time here in politics. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? There are a lot of variables there, Dr. Tom. But Xi Jinping has 1 billion people who are ticked off with him, and protesters are calling for his resignation. So, what we do know, Dr. Tom, is that all people thirst for freedom.
That's right.
We know that. And if a government, any government, push people around, push them too hard, they will push back. There will be a backfire. But while the personal risks are high, it's amazing to see Chinese citizens taking a stand for freedom. So the Borellis say, stay tuned.
Absolutely, Denise. We have no idea what's going to happen next. You wake up in the
No.
morning, you turn on the TV or you open up your phone to see what the news is, and all of a sudden it seems out of nowhere the Chinese people are rebelling against their government, which is a good thing. How far it goes, as you mentioned, we have no idea. Will he invade Taiwan as a grand distraction? We have no idea. It is a very unstable time, very uncertain time. But as you mentioned, the most important fact is that people do thirst for freedom. And if an authoritarian government goes too far, and clearly they have in China, how dare they lock people in apartment buildings and let them starve to death?
Yeah.
How brutal can you get? And you don't think people are going to rebel with that? But again, in these isolated areas, like when you have a communist leader, he's got all his pals around him saying, oh yeah, everything's all right. There'll be no downside, but now there is a downside. So we just, as you mentioned, Deneen, we just have to stay tuned, and no doubt we'll be addressing this issue again in another coming edition of Reigniting Liberty.
That's it, Dr. Tom. Well, folks, thanks for checking out Reigniting Liberty. And remember, everyone has a role to play. What are you doing for liberty? Until next time.